Welcome to another edition of the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I have an interview with colorist, inker, letterer, penciler, and writer Ron Kasman. Based in Ontario, Ron's been called the unsung genius of Canadian comics, and he's been recognized for his work on Captain Canuck, Negative Burn, and the Tower of the Comic Book Freaks series. In part one of this interview, Ron talks about his part in the Heroes of the Homefront Kickstarter project, his Tower of the Comic Book Freaks series, the early days of comic books in Canada, his contribution to Captain Canuck, plus the trials and tribulations of publishing a comic book here in Canada. Before I go further, I encourage you to like this podcast on iTunes and definitely check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website. Like it on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram so you can discover a lot more information about Canadian comic book creators and supporters. And now, part one of my chat with Ron Kasman.
I recently interviewed Ivan Kokmarek for his project, the Kickstarter project, Heroes on the Homefront. And I wanted to know what's your connection to that?
That's where I saw your name.
Yeah.
Oh, well, my connection is fairly limited. Ivan did the book. I've got nothing to do with the book, but what we have is in common is we're aging comic fans. We've been doing this most of our lives. He really enjoys the Canadian comics of the early 40s. They don't mean that much to me, but we have so many commonalities in our in growing up with comics that I very much enjoy his company. I think he enjoys mine too. I'm a bit of an artist, and he asked me if I would do a one-page comic strip about the early Canadian comics. So I did that, and he's using that to promote his comic on a Kickstarter. So he lives in Hamilton. I live in Toronto. We don't see each other all the time, but I think we enjoy seeing one another when we do. And sometimes I'm lucky enough to sit on a panel with him at a comic convention talking about Canadian fan history. I usually come in the early 70s.
I meant to ask you about your graphic novel, the Tower of Comic Book Freaks. Seems to be
getting the Tower of the Comic Book Freaks.
Yeah, been getting a bit of a revival, so to speak. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and the trials and tribulations, I guess, of getting it completed and published.
Okay. Well, at one point, it's easier to write those things, to write them down than it is to draw them. Drawing is a long, long commitment. Writing you can do in your spare time. So what happened to me was I wrote and drew a 41-page comic book for Desperado Publications. That's a Georgia-based comic company. They're probably best known for Negative Burn, and I've had my work printed there close to a dozen times in Negative Burn. So because it was such a long story, I emailed Joe Pruitt, the publisher, and said, would you accept a 41-page story by me? And he thought that would be a great idea. So the book was, my comic was finished. It was even being advertised at the store level, but it hadn't come out yet. Anyway, it didn't make minimum sales. And at that point, Joe Pruitt folded his company. So I was sitting on a 41-page comic and decided that I would not draw another comic until this thing sold. And it was becoming harder and harder to sell. That's not a real short story, but it's a shorter story. It was becoming very hard to sell the shorter stories. People weren't interested in anthologies or single issues. It was kind of over for that. So in that time, I started writing other stories because I had sworn I would not draw one. And let's see, I wrote one about growing up as a Jew and then being involved in the Church of Scientology. And this was a fictitious story, but it got into Scientology and it got into Judaism. And what I was advised, actually by a lawyer, was if it would make a great story, but you'll probably get sued. If you don't get sued, you're going to be waking up in the middle of the night, every night, wondering if you'll get sued tomorrow. And I thought, yeah, he's right. It's a litigious organization. Maybe I shouldn't do that one. I did one about a Canadian superhero. And everyone's doing one about a Canadian superhero. And I don't know what would make mine interesting. I did one about, let's see, the superhero one was called The Golden Man. The Scientology one was called From Moses to Elron. And I also did one about Canadian fandom. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting to the few people that were around to watch Canadian fandom grow up. But no one else was going to buy the thing. And the one that I settled on was one that combined a possible level of interest with a joy of drawing. And that was called, at the time it was called Going Down the Road. And I don't know if you're familiar with the movie of the same name from the very early 1970s, but the working title was based on an old movie. But it was about 5 guys from Toronto driving down to New York City for a comic book convention. At the convention, they become interested in at the time, New York was like Sodom and Gomorrah together. It was just a horrible place.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. It was, you go down there today and you just can't believe what it had looked like. And it was cleaned up by a variety of things that were happening all at the same time. American cities were getting cleaned up. New legislation was being put in. So these guys go down and they want to see the wicked underbelly of New York. And one of them meets a beautiful girl. One of them wants to start buying up comics, and one wants to get into the art scene down there. So it's about 5 guys going down, but it's mostly about one of the guys. One of them goes down, meets an artist who has been, I don't know if you're familiar with what happened in the early to mid-50s in the United States. The Senator Estes Kavaver, who later ran as vice president with Adlai Stevenson, who was running for president, had a commission on juvenile delinquency. You've probably heard something about
Yes,
that.
I have. Yes, that's right.
Okay. So what happened was, in my story, not in reality, an artist gets blacklisted and he just can't get any work. And he's considered to be one of the greatest artists of all time in comics, but nobody will hire him. So he's getting his big break at after 15 years out of the business with a company called Under Comics, a completely fictitious company. And he's decided that though he's having his big break, he doesn't want to do the book. He wants to hire an assistant to do it. And because he was helped out by one of these guys, and one of these guys can draw a little bit, he wants the person to draw like him, and he's convinced that he can teach him to draw very quickly. So that's the heart of the story. And the subplot is the young fellow meets a young woman, and they fall in love with one another in the space of a weekend. So it's a love story, a story about a fictitious artist, and also a story about early fandom. When you go to a comic convention today, I understand the summer one in Toronto, Comic Expo, has about 80,000 people coming to it. And I don't know if those are 80,000 discrete individuals, or if one person going Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday is considered to be 4 people. But regardless, it's become mainstream. People go to these things now. It's considered normal. Whole families go to them. What do you want to do this weekend? Well, the comic convention's coming to town. Right now, every small town in Ontario has a convention. Kilsenberg has comic conventions. But when it started, it wasn't that way at all. When it started, the biggest comic convention was in New York City, and only about 500 people went to it, and that was the Phil Suling Convention. It was called the New York Comic Art Convention. When I went, there were about 500 people. My convention is not the Phil Suling Convention. I call mine the New York Comic Book Convention. And I don't pretend it to be Sulings, but there are parallels. The big parallel is they're very small, but they feel big. When you're in your hometown and you're the only person in the whole high school reading comic books, and then you go down and you find 500 like-minded people, it just seems enormous. So it just changes things in your mind. So it's an exploration of the early convention.
Now I was going to ask, you mentioned the troubles of getting published, but today there seems to be quite the reverse. Your novels are on Amazon and Indigo. It seems there's more opportunities now for comic creators.
Okay, my own observation is that getting published now is the easiest thing in the world. All that you need is a couple $1,000s, or to be able to find a couple $1,000s. Even on a couple $100 you can get published, but what you can't get is distribution. You can put it up yourself on Amazon, but there's so many comics on Amazon that it gets lost. Again, this is my own observation, and my observation is limited here, but this is how it looks to me, that you can go to press, and unless you're going to press with just a couple of books, the chances of somebody buying them are slim, just because there's so many people out there doing much of the same thing. So you've got to decide. I mean, a lot of people are self-publishing. It's never been harder to find a distributor. We're down to only one now, so there's no sense of competition between people. There's no sense of a distributor saying, I better pick that up, or the other guy will pick that up, and it may be the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That's ancient history. If you go to, if you actually find a publisher and you don't sell enough through the distributor, you can't resolicit for another year. And the distributors want minimum sales at the store level. So we've substituted one problem, being unable to find a publisher because you can self-publish, for another problem, on being unable to get it out there, except on Amazon, where you're in competition with a lot of other people. I was at a comic convention, it could be almost 3 years ago now, and there was a fellow sitting beside me. His name might come to me, but I just don't recall it right now. And he was really good. If he was around in the early 70s or late 60s, he would have been working for Warren. He would have had contracts. And he was selling, a few copies of his book. And I heard him say, oh yeah, I made under $100. And then I said, I made under $1,000. I mean,
right.
How much money did you make?
Sure.
He wasn't talking to me. I wasn't going to be completely rude about it. But he wasn't making any money.
Yeah.
And I continued to listen to him talk. And he said, this thing's doing pretty well, and I'm going to get some free time soon. And then I'm going to go around from store to store and see if they'll take it. And I thought, is that what it has come to? A guy with your ability, which was enormous, having to go from store to store. Even your success stories today about people selling, 700, 800 books. During the black and white boom of the 1980s, you generally didn't get distribution unless you had at least 2,000, and you sure didn't make any money at 2,000. You had to print about 5,000 to make some money. So, anyway, it's the last time I'm going to say it. Distribution is a real problem.
Sure.
When you get 80,000 people coming to the one at the convention, and 170,000 people going to San Diego, and many, many of those people are interested in being part of the industry. These things are just all over the place. Something has to separate you from the other people before they're going to go somewhere.
So I was going to say that's definitely an issue, and I think one way that you've been trying to get around that is to publicize yourself. And I've seen you've done some great interviews. In fact, you gave a talk just recently in Toronto about your graphic novel, and I was curious about what the response you received from the audience when you gave that talk.
Well, I got a good response.
Good.
But let's I mean, I spoke at TCAF. I've spoken at the Comic Expo. I spoke at Niagara. I spoke at Forest City Comic Convention. Yeah, I can't say I'm in demand as a speaker. I tend to be knocking on the other doors. The people who own the doors are not knocking on mine. I think I do a good job with it, but it's still tough making a go. When I did it at TCAF, I guess TCAF didn't know what to expect, so they put me in a room that sat 20. 50 people came, exactly 50. And they were just packed in, and there were people on the outside, too. Now, I called the topic, I did it, you can do it, too. How to draw a graphic novel. And a lot of people stayed behind after to listen to me talk a bit more about how to draw a graphic novel. The person who was in there before me, she might have peaked at 7. So I thought I was doing pretty well. I was very, very happy.
I was going to say that the reason for the abundance of people at your talk, TCAF, was that there seems to be a growing interest now of people who have now a forum to get their views out, get their sensibilities out, their stories out, and they're looking to people in the industry who have done it successfully. Would you say that that's going on now today?
Yeah, that's definitely a trend. I'm absolutely sure of that. It's almost as though it's growing geometrically. And if I can give you a parallel situation, which I read about, I don't know how many people care about folk music at all, but if you think of Dylan's early music, there are a lot of people that care about it. They just gave the guy a Nobel Prize, for goodness sake.
That's right.
Yeah, so if you don't think of it as folk music and think of it as early Dylan, and then you think about Dylan wasn't the only one. There were a lot of good people doing that. So I read an account of someone who was there in New York City when it was starting out, and the person said, well, you'd go down to... there was a park in Greenwich Village where people were doing it. And he said, you'd go down to the park, and there'd be 12 people strumming on guitars. And then the next week, there'd be 24 people. And then the week after that, there'd be 40 people. And it was also growing at a remarkable rate. One day history will tell us just how fast the graphic novel thing is growing. If you go into chapters in Mississauga, there are 4 bookcases full of graphic novels and dozens and dozens and dozens of bookcases of other types of books. But the store has a finite size. It'll be interesting to see in a year or two if there's still 4 bookcases, or if there are 10 bookcases, or if they ever get to be half the store, which I don't expect.
No.
But it wasn't that long ago. Well, you'd call graphic novels a comic book. I like the term comic books myself. I don't think it matters what you call them. But whatever you do call them, a large bookstore did not have an area for them. Now the large bookstore does, and they're selling them online too. They see it as part of their profit potential. So yeah, they have been going somewhere. No telling if the trend will continue.
Sure. I wanted to ask you also, I did some research. You had some contribution to the iconic Canadian character Captain Canuck. I'm wondering if you have any insight on that.
Small contribution?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know what you read, but Richard and I have been friends for over 40 years, probably about 43 years. I'm 63 years old. When I was 20 years old, hitchhiking across Canada was a national pastime. There were youth hostels in every town where a young person or an older person could go, and for $1 or often for nothing, you got a place to sleep and usually something to eat. And I think the fellow's name was Richard Olson. He was a mass murderer, killed about 18 hitchhikers. So he ended all that. But before he did, I decided to hitchhike from Toronto to Vancouver. And after 3 days, I got to Winnipeg. And can you imagine this? I hadn't bathed in 3 days. I had 3 days of 5 o'clock shadow.
Oh, my.
I looked pretty bad. And it was a Sunday, I remember that. And I phoned up Richard Cumley and I said, "Hi, you don't know me, but I've read your comic. Can I come over?" So he put me up for several days.
There you go.
Put up with me for several days, you might say. He was about 3 years my senior. And at the time, I was actually working as a commercial artist, and I took a leave of absence. I didn't like the job much, and I had it in my own head that if they didn't give me a leave of absence, I was quitting. You know, I really wanted to go across Canada. That was more important to me than the job. So Richard took me in for about 4 days, and when someone does that, you don't forget it. He was a genuinely nice man, and he remains a genuinely nice man. I was working as a commercial artist. I was also in school. I had life plans, but I had no idea how those plans were going to go. He had 2 kids at the time. On top of that, his wife was pregnant. He had a business that employed George Freeman and Jean-Claude Saint-Aubin. He had an office in a house, which I assume was rented. It might have been purchased. I really don't know. But he had a whole life, and I was still starting mine. He was just a little bit older. So back then, of course, there were no emails. We corresponded through the mails. I was a little bit of an artist. My art was quite bad. And I was nowhere near ready to work on his comics. He had guys there that were way, way beyond me. But I got a little bit better, and I drew just a few days of his newspaper strip, and he wanted me to take over the newspaper strip, but I just didn't see it as something I could do with any speed, and I thought it would be frustrating. But I did draw the newspaper strip for a short while. Later, I inked and lettered his comic. And I'm proud to have been associated with it. So that would be the extent. And we remain, I think I could say, close friends.
You can hear the continuation of my chat with Ron in the next podcast. And you can find Ron's The Tower of Comic Book Freaks online at Amazon.ca and Chapters Indigo online too. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. I invite you to subscribe, like, and comment on the podcast. So please send your feedback to truenorthcountrycomics@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Come back soon for another episode. Bye for now.